So we last time we spoke about the status of Sephardic Jews today. We spoke about the different definitions: Sephardi, Ashkenazi, Oriental versus the non-existent Occidental or Eastern and Western. There's also, I don't know if you know, but there is recently people are using it more openly. They're speaking about black Jews and white Jews. Where black Jews refers to Sephardim. I don't know if you heard that in Israel, especially with the elections, the previous elections, they brought up like the white tribe or the white clan, and indeed the nickname or the derogatory term for Sephardim among Yiddish speakers in Israel was Schwarze. Either Frank or Schwarze. And Schwarze means black. So there is that term. Of course, nobody uses that officially, but it exists. And the term Jews of Arab land or Jews of Islamic land or Arab Jews. We have all these terms. I think that, like I said, in my opinion, the classic definition should stay Sephardim and Ashkenazim, because it's a culture that goes back 1,000 years for the Ashkenazim and almost 1,500 years for Sephardim. And then, if you want to talk about what is happening in Israel, you could speak about Mizrahi from the point of view of the people who labeled people as Mizrahim, but not as self-identification. It's very rare to hear a Jew, an Israeli Jew, says, I'm Ani Mizrahi. Other people say, you belong to the Eidot HaMizrach. They will label him, he would not label himself. The way one would label himself is either a Sephardi or specifically with the country of origin. I'm Moroccan, Iraqi, Kurdish, Bukhari, Azari, Uzbeki, whatever it is, but not I'm Mizrahi. And even within that, to be more specific, the Iraqis would say I'm Baghdadi, Moslawi, Basrawi, like after the city, which whether it's Baghdad or Mosul or Basra or among the Syrian Shami and Halabi. There's a very clear sense of identity with the locality, but there's no locale called Mizrah that the Jews identify themselves with. And that's important to have in mind. That being said, I want to just read the introduction to the article of Nissim Leon. Nissim Leon is an important scholar in sociology and the state of Jews in Israel, the status of the different groups in Israel today. And I'll read through it and use that to highlight some of the problems and tensions that arise in Israel. So he writes this: in this article I propose a historical, sociological, and ethnographic framing of the ethnic structuring of the group generally known within Haredi society in Israel as Sephardim. So he will talk, from the point of view of a sociologist, of how this group is defined by the Haredi community. Now, the Haredi community in Israel has a large portion of this Haredi community is Sephardi or Sephardi, but the general appearance and message that they convey aligns more with the Ashkenazi world. Starting with the dress code. The dress code of the Haredi world is the one thing that is common to all of them is a hat. Everybody wears a hat, a black, usually wide-brimmed hat. And among the Hasidim, there's a different type of headgear, wool sometimes called this. There's a shtremel, there's a spodik among the Gur Hasidim. All these garments are ancient. They're either pre-World War pre-World War II. This is the black hat that all the yeshiva boys wear until today. This is how people used to dress before the war, and some of the Hasidic garb goes back 200 or 300 years. This, in the Haredi world, is the epitome of anti-modernization, the refusal of adapting to changing cultures and taking a still frame of the past and sticking to it, saying this is how our forefathers used to dress. Now, if you would confront them with a drawing of the Hatam Sofer from the 17 or 1800s with a completely different headgear, they will have no answer. But that doesn't matter. We don't care about historical drawings or pictures or such evidence. What we know, what our rabbis told us, that's what we do. And the reason that they adhere to that dress code, where it started before the Holocaust, between the two world wars, as some Rashi Yeshivot, mainly the Yeshiva of Slavotka, that followed the teachings of the Rabbi of Kelm, Rabbi Simcha Zissel Ziv of Kelm, who believed that the yeshiva boys have to look dignified and impeccable. And that was a change, that was a complete paradigm shift in the yeshiva world, because up until that time, up until the war, the yeshiva boys were the nebechs. They were not well dressed. They were poor. They didn't have a sense of dignity, because that's how the community treated them. They would be what is called ochlei yamim. They would eat at the homes of the local, the citizens of the city or village where they lived, and the rabbi of Kelm and then the rabbi of Slavotka both felt that in order for them to be successful with their Torah study, they have to feel dignified. They have to have a sense of self-dignity. There was a completely different type in the Novhardok Yeshiva, where they would want people to feel no sense of shame towards the world. So they would not be ashamed of studying Torah. So they would send the students to the street with a leaf of cabbage on their head, tell them go to the pharmacy and ask to buy nuts and bolts, which they didn't sell there, so they laugh at you, and you realize you learn how to deflect laughter and shame. But the Rabbi of Kelm wasn't happy with that. He took it to a different direction, and he said you have to look sharp. So the yeshiva boys started dressing with following the latest fashion of Europe, with a short jacket, a hat, a walking stick, and also a huge innovation back then. They used to shave. Everybody else grew their beard. They shaved at least until the wedding. After the Holocaust, that short period where people used to wear hats, it was maybe 10, 15 years, has become sacred, because it's the last thing that you remember from the pre-Holocaust world. And then everybody is wearing, at least the rabbis are wearing hats, and then it became the flag and the dress code of the yeshiva world. And now is promoted as a way to set yourself apart from the rest of the world. And to me it's very disturbing entering a study hall in Lakewood, when I visit Lakewood once in a while, and see 300 hats. And everybody's wearing a black suit and white shirt, and you feel that there is instead of the dignity that the early rabbis before the war tried to instill in people, we are now in that community, the Haredi community, entered a phase of complete anonymity or lack of identity, because everybody looks the same and dresses the same and does the same, and that is really a terrible thing for them. However, this whole thing, like I said, like the dress code and not willing to change, is part of the exilic mentality and the lack of willingness to change and to modernize. And this, outside the Haredi world, did not happen to the Sephardim. To those Sephardim who were engulfed and swallowed by the Haredi world, it did happen. But to those who stayed outside that world, they kept evolving. Even as observant Jews, they did not equate being Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox with, for example, if you came from Yemen, that you have to walk with a robe. Or, if you came from Tunisia, from Jerba, up to not too long ago, they used to wear a sharwal, like wide pants. In Iraq, already in the turn of the century, in the late 1800s, people wore suits and ties, but that was not the point. Once that fashion changed, they changed that as well. You see the same thing with the language. Sephardic Jews didn't stick and insisted, that we're going to keep speaking Arabic or Ladino. If they moved to an English-speaking country or to a Hebrew-speaking country, that's what they spoke. Meanwhile, in the yeshivot, the Yiddish remained sort of the holy or the language that everybody speaks. Of course, it's used also as a tool of separation. So the Haredi culture by itself already has this very very clear markers that sets it apart from the rest of society. Is the dress code, the language, and I believe that a lot of these things are kept artificially by the rabbis because that's the way to isolate their people from the rest of society. You can add to that also the rejection of core studies, where they don't allow to teach in the schools language, math, science at a high level, and the refusal to serve in the army. So now Leon is going to speak about the group that within the Haredi world is called Sephardim. And the truth is they don't call them Sephardim, they say Sephardim. Like they shorten this the whole term Sephardim. And he says the term refers to the Jews whose families originate in Islamic countries or the Balkans, as opposed to Ashkenazim, whose origins lie in Eastern or Central Europe. The use of the categorical appellation Sephardim seeks, if as it were, to identify this group as the descendants of the Jews expelled from Spain in the late 15th century, who maintain a different tradition of halakha and custom from those followed by their Ashkenazi counterparts, and who are hence organized separately on the communal level with separate educational institutions and yeshivot, religious academies. So that phrase by itself, as it says, as if it were, but it's not. Because, as we mentioned before, Sephardim and Ashkenazim is a term that goes way before the 15th century. There is that identity of the Sephardic world that is closely tied to that of Baghdad. And the Sephardic yeshiva, on the other hand, when he speaks about separate educational institution and yeshivot, you have to be careful with that statement, even though he speaks of modern times. The truth is that up until the arrival to Eretz Israel, and some other things that happened in the 1950s, the methodology of the Sephardic yeshiva world was quite different than that of the Ashkenazi. The curriculum of the Sephardic yeshiva included the trivium, and sometimes the trivium, which was rhetoric, math, and grammar, and in some yeshivot it also included science and music. And in addition, in the Sephardic yeshivot, there was an emphasis on studying the correct pronunciation of reading the Torah, knowing the whole Tanakh. Some places you had to know the whole Mishnah before you proceeded to Halakha. There was a different curriculum. Then, when they got to Israel, when we speak about separate educational institutions in yeshivot, we are not talking about a different curriculum or a different approach, but rather about segregation. It means Ashkenazi, or not Ashkenazi, yeshivot in general, without appellation, without label, Sephardi or Ashkenazi, just yeshiva, are yeshivot where most of the students are Ashkenazim, and the methodology of learning is Ashkenazi as well. When I say Ashkenazi, it's usually Lithuanian, following the methodology of the dynasty of Brisk Brisk, I think today is called Bresk-Litovsk. That's the name of the city, Brisk today. So that is the Ashkenazi yeshiva. The Ashkenazi yeshiva is mostly Ashkenazi students, and the methodology is Lithuanian. The Sephardic yeshiva is a yeshiva where most of the students are Sephardic. Most of the rabbis are Ashkenazi, and the methodology is Ashkenazi as well. So rather than calling them separate educational institutions, you should call them segregated educational institutions, where there is a numerous clausus. Until today, there's a quota that the yeshivot allow to accept how many Sephardic students they are allowed to accept. In some yeshivot, it's 15%. In other, it's 20%. And there is even a city in Israel today, Kiryat Sefer, not far from Modi'in, where there's the same numerous clauses regarding citizens. You can't just buy a house in Kiryat Sefer. You have to go through a committee. And if you are Sephardic, then they have to see if you didn't pass the quota of the city. And the quota is also per building and per neighborhood. Just amazing that this is happening in Israel. I have a second cousin, I forgot his last name, but he has an Ashkenazi last name. Iraqi, he's half Iraqi, and it looks very dark. And he arranged for buying the apartment, everything through the real estate developer, and he never visited the city. He bought the apartment. And I heard from him that when he got there, they were shocked. Like, they didn't know that they're getting another Sephardic who was tipping the balance in the city. But that's the mentality. There are very few yeshivot that still adhere to the Sephardic school of thought. Allegedly, there was one such yeshiva in Yerushalayim called Porat Yosef. That's where Rabbi Ovadia Yosef studied. And for a while it was, but not anymore. Even now, the methodology is mostly Ashkenazi. There may be more emphasis on Halakha, which is just focusing on Halakha, is usually more typical to the Sephardic yeshivot. The one yeshiva that one could argue today that still follows a pure Sephardic, or at least one strand of Sephardic learning, is Kisei Rahamim, the throne of mercy, Kisei Rahamim, in Bnei Barak, headed by Rabbi Mazuz. But other than that, the ruling methodology is that of the Ashkenazi school, to the extent that I even now, again, I'm going back to the now, here and now, even here in America, I hear from my son that he has sometimes arguments with the rabbi, who's a very modern, open-minded person, who says that the Ashkenazi learning method is superior. And his proof is that this is the system that is used in all the yeshivot. And I tell him that the fact that one methodology took over the other is not a proof to its superiority in terms of understanding the text, but rather to the way it appeals to people. The Litvak or Lithuanian method of study is like abstract mathematics. It allows you to analyze and reanalyze a word or a concept and breaking it to a million little pieces and create new categories. That I'm going now like into sort of the Talmudic studies, but it provides no practical results. And so, to the extent that when it comes to halakha, if you come and ask one of the great rabbis who teaches Talmud in the yeshiva, what should I do in case of ABC? He says, I don't know, go ask a posek. Yeah, I'm just studying theoretical Talmud. And I think I could confidently say today that 90% of the students in the Ashkenazi yeshiva world are studying abstract material, theoretical, and without any practical application. And if those of you will tell you that they study halakha, they're not studying with the purpose of analyzing halakha and finding solutions to existing problems, but rather the study is geared towards memorizing and understanding all the legal aspects of any practice or halakha as they are done today, to upkeep them, and if there is a dynamic halakha ruling, usually it's towards saying, don't do this also. There's no, the movement is one-sided. I want to define that before we continue into this discussion to understand where the yeshivot stand today. They're one more example to how this stereotype of the yeshivot, of the Ashkenazi yeshivot being superior because they have Ashkenazi students, versus the Sephardic yeshivot who follow the same methodology but have mostly Sephardic students, is that, again, I heard from someone who was involved. He was sort of like the recruiting officer for the yeshiva. And one year, the students of a Sephardic yeshiva in Yerushalayim, called Kol Yaakov, founded by Rabbi Ades of Syria, the students who graduated their middle school, what is called Yeshiva Ktana, the minor yeshiva, and were now about to choose where to go for the major yeshiva, Yeshiva Gdula. Some of the most brilliant students in the classroom, who were Sephardic themselves, stood up and said, we are not going to continue in this yeshiva, we're going to search for another one. And the rabbi asked them, this recruiting officer said, why don't you want to stay here in Kol Yaakov? And they answered, because there are too many Sephardic students here. So they felt that even though they are Sephardic, studying with too many Sephardic students marks them as inferior. This is how deep that goes. So he says here this: my aim is to explain how the term Sephardim within the context of Haredi society speaks less to an ancient lineage or a distinct set of customs and more to the social structuring of a stigmatized identity category. So he wants to say, or in other words, it's racism. Other than saying that, the Sephardim is a term that the Haredi community uses to describe an ethnicity, in saying, not ethnicity, like a halachic group. We follow a certain minhag, they follow a different minhag. The term is more of a racist term, and this is true. There is racism, like I said, in numerous clauses, in not letting students into schools, but also in the general way that you would hear some leaders of the Haredi community, and that is, by the way, even in the modern Orthodox community, that sends its students to the army and is much more integrated within the Sephardic world, we have the same mentality, which comes from both sides. The Ashkenazi side feels superior, and the Sephardi side feels inferior, and therefore wants to assimilate or to emulate the Ashkenazi world. He says this: the root of this social structuring goes back to the period following World War II, when some leading Ashkenazi Haredi figures, in a manner paralleling the strategy of Zionist leaders, set their sights on Jewish communities in Islamic countries as a potential reservoir to replenish and continue their own communities which had been decimated in the Holocaust. So that is a key paragraph and extremely important. First of all, let's speak about what he says, the strategy of Zionist leaders. The strategy of Zionist leaders, and I think it's something that we touched briefly upon earlier, is that after the Holocaust, there was a massive operation to bring to Israel Jews from Arab lands. Whereas in the beginning, when they were planning the immigration before the war, Sephardic Jews or Mizrahi Jews were not part of the plan. Not too many people know that, but with the ideal of the Zionist movement to build a Europe in Israel, or a mini Europe in Israel, Sephardic Jews, for them, would have been an obstacle. So there was no proactive campaign to recruit Jews from Iran, Iraq, Yemen, Morocco, Tunisia, Turkey. All these countries were neglected. The one country where there was a stream of immigrants that goes all the way back to the 1800s was Yemen, but that is a very sad story. I don't know if you know of the story of exploitation of Yemenite Jews by the some of the Moshavot. I think it's either Degania or Kinneret. I don't want to mention. We have to look up the details. But Sheva Araki, I think, wrote about that. But they were brought to Israel before there was Israel, still Palestine, and were used by the farmers as cheap labor force. They were not given land or anything like that. They worked the same farms, the same fields as settlers who came from other parts of Europe, but they were not given land. Even though nobody really owned the land, they bought it from the Sukhnut, not the Sukhnut. There were different organizations who would buy the land. It was not distributed equally, and so basically were treated like slaves. So there was no intention of bringing Sephardic or Mizrahi or Jews from Arab lands into Israel as part of the Return to Zion project. But after the Holocaust, there was no choice. There was a dire need for working hands, for people to populate the lands, and Europe was not the option at the time. I think I mentioned before that some people believe that the Mossad aggressively tried to shake the Jews of Iraq specifically, to scare them to migrate to Israel. So there were a couple of bombings in synagogue in Baghdad, and some people claim that it was the Israeli government or the Mossad who did that to scare the Jews. Now, of course, if we look at what is happening in Iraq now, we could say it was a blessing that the Jews left. But the way that Iraqi Jews left was quite disastrous, because the government said that people could leave, but you had to file of course, for a permit to leave. The moment people signed up for that, after the government waited for the majority of people to sign, and then it announced that you're not allowed to take any property with you. You're not allowed to sell. You're not allowed to take physical property with you. So people basically sold whatever they had or abandoned it, and if they sold it for dimes. They were limited, I think, to something like 50 or 250 dinar they could carry with them, and they left behind real estate that is valued in the billions of dollars. Most of the palaces of Saddam Hussein are built over land that was appropriated from the Jews, and there was never an attempt to reclaim those possessions. If the government, maybe if the Israeli government would not have gotten involved, there would be still time until the 70s for the Jews to slowly liquidate their assets and leave, like the Persian Jews did in the 1980s, around the time of the revolution. They realized that something is happening, and they liquidated their assets and moved mostly to Los Angeles, but also to Great Neck in New York, and some to Israel. So this was a big. There was the wave of Aliyah from these countries in the 1950s, Iraq, Syria, whoever could get out. To Morocco, that wave came in the 1960s, but that became more problematic for Israel, because the situation in Morocco was not at all similar to what it was in other countries. In Iraq, when all other countries severed ties with Israel, Morocco was not hostile to Israel, and it was not hostile to the Jews. But agents of the Sukhnut took advantage of certain incidents and tried to convince Jews that the land is burning under their feet and they should go to Israel as soon as possible. The first wave of immigrants arrived, I don't know, tens of thousands or more, arrived at Israel, and they were not welcome. They were treated very badly. They were placed in like everybody else in Ma'abarot, in transition camps, but they were treated from the very beginning as some of them as criminals. They were treated as intellectually inferior. There are brochures of the Ministry of Education from the 1950s and the 1960s, telling teachers that they are dealing with a very primitive population that cannot even understand the concept of 3 dimensions, and everything is two-dimensional for them. That the grammar, and once you tell a teacher that the student is incapable, it will affect the way the teacher teaches. The Moroccan Jews who were put in Wadi Salib in Haifa were not given employment, and when they rebelled at a certain point and the riot started, the police right away escalated the confrontation and killed some of the rioters. That was a very sad incident. What happened next was that Moroccan Jews who came to Israel called their relatives in Morocco or wrote to them and said, "Don't come. You're not going to be welcomed." And as a result, the next waves of migration from Morocco, because they kept leaving Morocco, instead of coming to Israel, they went to France or to Canada. Canada then had a policy of opening its doors because it wanted to populate the country, and it offered generous incentives. And a lot of Moroccan Jews went to Canada, and they're a very prosperous community there. And I think I mentioned that Semi Shitrit wrote a book called Mapecha Ashkenazit Meta, the Ashkenazi Revolution, where he describes some things that you cannot describe other than atrocities that were committed towards the Sephardim, unfortunately, during those times. And what he did a genetic research, meaning looking at people that carry the same DNA, not really breaking down the genome, it wasn't available then, but he looked at relatives, brothers, cousins, nephews and uncles, who separated. Some of them went to Israel, some of them went to Canada or France, and he wanted to see where they are in the on the social ladder, and it was consistent. In most of the cases, the people who came to Israel from the same families, same parents, siblings, in Israel were at the bottom of the social ladder, and in France and Canada, they were scholars, academics, businessmen, lawyers, etc. So something went wrong there in Israel, and it was a problem. Because of the insular type of the Haredi community, while in the general community there is a slow progress, within the Haredi community that is almost not happening, and there's still very strong labeling. It would still be very hard to find a Haredi man who was married to Ashkenazi was married to Sephardi and vice versa. I mean, if they both grew up in a Haredi house, it almost will not happen. If one of them is a Baal Teshuvah, someone who returned to Judaism at a later time, you might see that. But if both grew up as what we call frum, or frum from birth, observant from birth, it's Ashkenazim marry Ashkenazim, Sephardim marry Sephardim. It's almost an intermarriage. So now that is what happened in the Zionist, in the secular Zionist world. What happened in the Ashkenazi world? In the Ashkenazi world, the devastation was even greater, because the majority of the yeshivot, or what is called the yeshiva world or the Torah world, perished in the Holocaust. And now they're looking into who is going to be the next generation. So there were those who before the Holocaust went to Israel. There were those who were in America, but other than that, the situation looked bleak. So what happened was that the heads of the Ashkenazi yeshivot approached. They devised a plan, and they said that they wanted to save the Jews of the Middle East, the Jews of North Africa. Mainly, they set their sight on North Africa, and of all countries, the countries that they really looked at were Morocco and Algeria, more than anywhere else, because they were relatively easy to access. You couldn't go to Iraq after 1945, but you could go to Morocco, and there was an Ashkenazi presence in Morocco, even in the 1930s. People came already. And the Moroccan Jews accepted them with great hospitality. Rabbi Mesas writes about a certain rabbi who came and tried to create yeshivot in Meknes and other cities in the Ashkenazi style. And Rabbi Mesas describes how initially they accepted him willingly, and they worked with him, and they gave him great respect. At a certain point, they realized that he does not respect their values or tradition, and or halakha, and they broke up with him. So, but this is one case. But what the rabbis did, they created this plan of speaking about saving the Jews, saving the Sephardic Jews, and they found. They went, in America. They went to some of the philanthropists of the Syrian community, and they said, "We need your help to save the Jews of North Africa." From what? They didn't say exactly from what, right? But they painted the picture of, it's a physical danger, religious assimilation, which all was not true. And there was a man by the name of Isaac Shalom in New York, Yitzhak Shalom, that is still, is venerated in the certain community for what he did. And they established an organization called Otzar Torah that recruited young people from Morocco and from Algeria, some from Tunisia as well, and sent them to yeshivot in America, in England, and in France. In America, it's the famous yeshiva in Lakewood, but mostly, because it was easier, those boys would be sent to yeshivot in England, one in Gateshead, and the other one in Sunderland, and in France, to a yeshiva called Aix-les-Bains, that was also called Chachmei Tzarfat, the sages of France. I met, a couple of years ago, I met the rabbi who heads this whole organization, who was originally born in Algeria. And he told me the story of how he was recruited. And he told me that, this is he's in his late 80s now. So this is 1940 something, after the war. And he told me that a rabbi came to Algeria. He lived in Oran, or the way they call it Wahran. So he lived in Oran, and the rabbi convinced him to go to Gateshead for 6 months. He went to Gateshead for 6 months, and he was 17 at the time. Before he went, he was already planning to go and study medicine in the Sorbonne in Paris. He was accepted. He was planning to start the studies after he comes back from England. He came back from England, and he already decided that he doesn't want to go to the university. He was brainwashed there. Of course, he didn't say that he was brainwashed, right? He saw the light. So he comes back home and he tells his mother, I didn't tell her that he wants to go to yeshiva because she would be very upset. But what he said that he now has become very observant, and though he had a girlfriend, he cannot see his girlfriend anymore. It's not allowed. So his mother obviously freaked out, that he's becoming a fanatic. And she said, let's try to find a solution. He says, I have a solution. Let me get married with her. This way we're not a boyfriend and girlfriend, we're a married couple. So she agreed. Her parents agreed. They got married. He says, the moment I got married, I took her and we went to Gateshead. And we never returned. And he says, and this is how I was saved. Now, he was about to become a doctor. His wife was planning to become a nurse. Obviously, both very intelligent people, but they were taken by the Ashkenazi school of thought, plucked away from their culture, denied the secular education and their plan of how to proceed in life, and dropped into this world of Torah. This is one case. It happened to thousands of people. The estimates are about 4,000 people at least. But you realize what it means. It's a brain drain. They took the brightest and more intellectual and most driven people and converted them into the Torah world. Now, many of them would have kept the Jewish faith and remain observant, but they would have combined life of Torah with modern life. And they would also have their heritage of how they learned and how they pronounced the words and their melodies, etc. And instead, they basically cut out a whole generation of spiritual and religious leadership from the North African Jewry, and on one hand left the other people without leadership, and took that all these potential leaders and turned them into Ashkenazed Sephardim. And I know many of them that basically have no clue about their tradition, and are also, they feel indebted because they were trained to believe that they were saved by this world. So this is what he's talking about here, that they set their sides of Jewish communities in Islamic countries as a potential reservoir to replenish and continue their own communities which had been decimated in the Holocaust. And they called it saving Jews, and that was an idea that was integral to the sense of solidarity among the global Jewish community following the war. And that, like I said, they became stigmatized within the Ashkenazi world. Like I said, they were willing to bring them in, to train them to be yeshiva students, but when it came time to get married with them, they had to marry their own kind. And they became sort of a subgroup within the Haredi group. But we'll stop here for a break and we'll continue after that with this article.